coming to those threats, and if you talk about ecology or how evolution happens, and I was very fortunate to see it happen in front of my eyes. I wasn't there throughout, but I used to visit parts which were affected by this natural disaster called the tsunami, wherein entire coastlines were wiped clean. The huge waves came and washed out any form of life on those islands. Just came, smashed all the trees, smashed down people's houses, killed species died, whatnot. In Little Andaman on the west coast and other places, because of the earthquake, a lot of the islands were actually uplifted. Some went down in the Nicobars, others in the Andamans went up. So the reef that was underwater suddenly came on top of the surface. And over years, in some parts, I mean, from few meters to even 200 meters, 300 meters, 400 meters, there are land masses which came up. In those places which were originally underwater, which came up, over the past 15, 20 years, there has been sand deposition because of wind bringing in dust, sand coming in from the sea, from the reef, which is broken down below, being washed ashore and being deposited as a new beach on new land. Then wind bringing in seeds of trees on the island next door or on the same island. Those seeds flying and kind of falling down there, rain coming, the seeds sprouting, which never would have grown up on a coral reef. Suddenly new trees, grass is growing. It's happening. It has been happening and it's still continuing to happen in some parts even today. Completely like a time lapse of over millennia probably, but we are seeing it in a matter of a few years how places are being colonized by species of plants as the first colonizers. Actually, the plants go there after the physical material of sand and mud and dust and whatnot go across. The first living forms of life are probably some few tiny minute bacteria and insects probably. Along with them are these seeds that kind of float ashore and kind of or fly ashore through wind and are deposited and kind of sprout from there. After that happens, other living beings like birds come. The birds fly over. They're in their droppings. Seeds are there. They help in pollination. Some of them insects will help in pollination. The seeds fall onto the ground. They germinate. A new forest is created. So it's a beautiful and in other places, mangroves, which were at one point of time had water, and then suddenly were exposed because they were uplifted. There's no more water there. So what was mangrove today now is freshwater ecosystem, or it's basically new trees have to come up. The mangroves have all died out. Mangroves have to go further to the shoreline. So the tsunami that kind of struck the Andaman Nicobar Islands in 2004, December 2004, it was very devastating to human communities and to coastal ecosystems, including wildlife. Completely devastated many ecosystems. But in and through that devastation, I've been telling you, species or even ecosystems were able to bounce back and have been able to bounce back because they were left to their own devices, and therefore no real major interference happened then. The interference is happening now. Another threat is our transshipment terminals, new ports, new seaports, agaram pagaram, some tourism establishments, some road they're going to build. All those are the threats to some of these natural ecosystems which have survived for so long. Even a tsunami, they've been able to survive and kind of bounce back. Once a road comes, after coal tar goes and a building comes, what will survive there? Anyway, that's a different story. But the tsunami of 2004, like I told you, had damaged and devastated these natural ecosystems. But through that, it is amazing to see how these natural ecosystems bounce back to life again. They still are. And the similarity, and there also is a difference which when it comes to human community. Both the tribal communities and the settlers who were affected by the tsunami. Not all, many of them were. Virtually all Nicobar Islanders were affected by the tsunami. Virtually all of them, because they were all coastal dwellers originally in the Nicobars. Now they've all been pushed further inland. They live in government housing mostly. Few are making their own traditional housing again, slowly. They were all living along the coast, so the entire villages got wiped out. People were left with only what they had on their bodies, nothing else. Not even a spoon from their house. The house was washed away. Not even a pencil. It was all washed away. So they were wearing a t-shirt or shirt or shorts or pants. Some of them had that, some of them didn't have that also. Because they were thrown about in the waves. That also got torn out of their bodies. Some were left stark naked on top of a tree. I had a colleague who was and had no clothes on him for like 15, 20 days. He survived it. Amazing. And he's one of those classic examples, but there are others as well who have amazing examples of resilience and of tenacity of wanting to live through a huge unimaginable calamity of the natural disasters. If you actually put yourselves in their shoes of seeing 30, 40 feet high waves coming in front of you and then going boom over you, it's a matter of life and death, yeah? And more death than life, actually. But people have been able to come out of that and kind of rebuild their lives. The government definitely helped through all of this. But through that assistance of help, or that notion and assistance of help, also came a huge amount of cultural and administrative and sociological change that came about. And I would say this outright, that it happened because of many knee-jerk reactions to how one deals with such disasters. Everybody wants to help, but everybody wants to help and be known that I am the fellow who's helping. It's me. I am the savior. Okay. And I am giving you this laddu, or I'm giving you this kapada, or I'm giving you this ghar, makan, whatever. It's me. Rather than saying, can I help you build your house? Can I help you rebuild your life? How do you want it? What do you want it? What can we do? And think about it slowly, try and kind of pursue it in that fashion. It's possible. What happened through that entire tsunami exercise of rehabilitation was people became very dependent on the governmental system, because government became the mother of all living creatures on the islands. Government is going to help. It is a good intention, is good, no doubt about the intention. But the way that intention was carried out brought about a huge amount of dependence on agency from the outside, and therefore cultural change was bound to kind of happen. Social cultural change is bound to happen. So the design of the house, the design of how people lived. Now I've been saying this as I mean, telling other friends and other people as well. One of the biggest disasters that happened through the tsunami, because there were many disasters that happened along with the tsunami. The physical tsunami itself was one event, but alongside that was this entire rehabilitation exercise, which created waves of change, different forms of changes that kind of came about to, especially human and sociological systems in the island. Was that of the way people used to live. They originally Nicobaris used to live as joint families, 2 to 3 families living under the same roof, the same house, brother and sisters or cousins or whatever, living in the same house, married into the same people, married into the same family. Ownership also was of community. Ownership was of the joint family. Suddenly, when the rehab after when the tsunami hit, the rehabilitation came about. People were housed in nuclear housing. So suppose you and I are brothers who are living under the same roof. The tumbler and plate and the bartan and the kapada were all shared. Of course, people had their own individual kapada as well. But after, when everything was given, it became mine. This is mine and that's yours. You live in a separate house and I live in this house. And people originally live in the same house. So what I have been studying in the Nicobars is for my PhD, and which I wrote about and can complete and all, was looking at these sharing systems. And especially for places which are islands, sharing becomes a very important component of how one can, or factor of how one can successfully live, actually. So, like I told you earlier on, to understand even wildlife, you have to kind of figure out and understand what does an island, living on an island, mean. You're surrounded by water. Only a ship or a boat or an airplane is going to bring you something from the outside, unless you swim and grow from island to island. Otherwise, you're stuck on the island. So, when people are living on the island, they have to be able to live in harmony with each other and with nature for them to be able to survive. So for nature, they've evolved systems wherein they would use nature in various ways, either as hunter gatherers or as horticulturists and so on and so forth. Demarcated land that could not be used and so on. And of course, with wildlife consuming what they were doing, but amongst themselves, it is very, very important to avoid conflict. Think of it as you and me, and or 3 or 4 of us living in the same room in one house, and that entire house is surrounded by water. If 5 of us have to live in that house eating dal, chawal, sambar, or whatever we're going to eat, biryani or whatever, we have to be able to share it and ensure that each is able to be happy. The moment we start fighting, one of us is going to kill each other, and it'll never end. It'll end up in maybe finally one person being alive. That's a very crude example, but that's trying to illustrate the fact that to be able to share is the way to be able to go forward and to avoid conflict. So the entire one of the aspects I studied was this entire sharing ecosystem in the systems in the Nicobar, where sharing became the norm. It would enable people to kind of live as family, as members of the same community, and also it was a means to avoid conflict. The tsunami brought about a huge change in many of those systems by kind of separating families, separating ownership systems, or changing ownership systems. It is very unfortunate, but it's a fact. It is a fact that by just jumping in and saying, I want to help, and doing whatever one thought that is a helpful tool before actually finding out how harmful or how good or beneficial it can be, just doing it because I thought I have the power to do it. That's a wrong way of addressing, especially when you're talking about indigenous tribal people who can't speak your own language, who speak a different, have a different culture, who are probably shy to say, kind of express themselves. One has to be able to spend time and understand. And in fact, the government had that time. It is 5 years before which the rehabilitation exercise actually took shape. In 2000, after 2005, 2010 was when the final houses were handed over back to the Nicobaris for them to live. So for 5 years, people are living in temporary shacks, in tin shelters, or in tents sometime, or in half-built houses here and there, so on and so forth. So there was ample amount of time to be kind of understand these nuances of livelihood on the ends. And I can again state it outright as a fact because my former, I mean, it is a fact. A former colleague of mine, he and I had tried to kind of helped try to help the government in understanding this facet of what we thought is important, because suddenly no one even expected a tsunami to kind of come and hit that space. It happened, and everything was wiped clean. So how does one kind of rebuild? What does one do? We were aware that there were these attempts to kind of help rebuild society and community and so on, but also aware that if they were going to do it in this streamlined, standardized fashion of saying "Tumhare liye ghar hai, tumhare liye ghar hai," without realizing that it is not tomorrow, it is hamara. It is people living together, right? And how they were sharing these, they could have easily done a much much better job. But unfortunately, the stakes are too high for contractors to be able to kind of come in and win contracts and undertake the tenders and so on. That took precedence over a reality of a shared existence on the islands. So that is one of the biggest threats that happens. It's past, but it is still shaping up in its own way amongst the new young generation of islanders who are there today. Because that's what they have seen as youngsters. See, climate change is affecting not just the Andaman Nicobar or only island ecosystem. Climate change is affecting all our ecosystems on the planet. We all live under the same sky. We all live with the same weather or similar weather patterns. Or it's all influenced one over the other and in adjacent geographies. So, like how we have flash floods or floods happening in Kerala and dry climate in some of the places, extreme levels of wetness of monsoon and so on. Islands too have these issues affecting them. But the sea level rise is one aspect. Now, sea level rise in the Andaman Nicobar is not particularly a threat. It is a threat in certain parts of the islands. But like I told you earlier on, remember the Andaman Nicobar are emergent hills. They are not flat little oceanic atolls, which are flat islands, which are flat. Only a few islands are flat. Car Nicobar Island in the Nicobar is flat. Chowra Island in the Nicobar also is flat. But virtually all the other islands are emergent hills. So there are high ground and low ground and so on. People live on higher ground mostly, some near the shore, of course. There will be change that will affect through climate change in terms of sea level rise in very small parts, because like I told you, even land masses have risen in the islands with the earthquake that kind of created the tsunami. So a lot of those places which originally were vulnerable to sea level rise are not necessarily going to be affected because they're higher and higher than they were originally. But apart from that, these weather events of excessive rainfall, and also the fact that the places which are now being under cultivation are not under any natural forest. Those places which have natural forest are more or less intact because they have vegetation over them as cover. Over even though there is excessive rain, only huge amounts of flash floods kind of wash away some of those systems. But the trees themselves look after them, are able to kind of keep the ground together. But that apart, um, the major threat being seen in a major way, because huge amount of government initiative to bring in tourism in a big way and also set up other ancillary or whatever, not I would say ancillary, but set up other forms of kind of economic initiative in the islands. The necessity and the idea of being able to improve livelihoods and the need to kind of create more money, of course, is required and important. But the dilemma is in how one does that. So the plan for, what the government has done through the Niti Aayog as a planning commission has thought of bringing in high value tourism into the islands, which is good in many ways. And bringing in high value tourism is good in its own way. But how it is conducted, why are they already have planned to kind of cut down many forests to do that, to build roads in areas which don't have any roads, which have huge amounts of wildlife in them, huge amounts of natural habitat, swamps, freshwater swamps, which have great amount of wildlife and I mean, unimaginable beauty. I'm sitting here in Goa and you're in somewhere in Hyderabad. Our urban systems compare in no way to these natural ecosystems in terms of beauty. So if the high value, low volume tourism is considered, there are open spaces in the islands which can be and should be used for that. But unfortunately, the plan is not to use those spaces, but to open up new areas. They have a 50-year plan of opening up forests in Little Andaman all the way up to West Bay in Little Andaman to create nature spas and resorts and whatnot, which is going to take away the natural beauty of those areas. In the Nicobars further south, Great Nicobar, there is this plan to kind of set up a transshipment terminal in at Campbell Bay at Galatia Park, which originally was a national park. It has been denotified by the National Board of Wildlife. It has been denotified from being a wildlife sanctuary to being a place to set up a transshipment terminal. And this is one of the places which is most severely affected by the tsunami. And even though they have it from seismologists and other earth science people that tsunamis are not going to occur in the near future with any great certainty, the fact is that it's not just tsunamis. These habitats are also home for a range of wildlife which are, like I told you earlier, which are found nowhere else and are very highly endangered. The giant leatherback sea turtle, which nests in the Galatia, where the transshipment terminal is proposed to come up. It's one of the most important turtle nesting beaches for that species. Now, why on earth the government is kind of planning to use that space? I know very well, because now I would say I don't know. I know very well. The fact is, the amount of investment is they're talking about 75,000 crores to go into that transshipment terminal. It's huge amounts of money, not just in 1 year, 2 years, over a 20, 30, 40-year period maybe. And of course, that amount will constantly increase because it's basically going to be another tsunami of cash coming in for such a number of people. And the people who are going to suffer are some of the tribal communities who live there, the Shompen who live in the forests of Great Nicobar. They have categorically stated that they don't want any form of development in their areas. This is going bang into the tribal reserve. These fancy resorts and spas of Little Andaman. The idea of having all of these is definitely required, but by opening up areas that are pristine in very many ways, or even if they're not pristine, they're natural ecosystems which are actually add and bring in natural beauty to the islands. They are being threatened because of all these forms of development. And as a person, as a researcher, as a scientist, what I'm suggesting to the government is to say, look, you already have spaces on a place like Little Andaman Island which have oil palm plantations, which have been of zero value. They have been a failure in the Andaman, and the government is trying to bring in oil palm plantations back into Andaman Nicobar with a huge amount of investment. But the fact is that all those plantations for 30 years, they have been the biggest failure. The government has already spent many crores on that enterprise to try and make it a profitable enterprise. It never worked. The entire forest corporation, which was holding that trying to hold it together, has been wound up. The employees have been paid their last few salaries and said, Tata, bye, bye, bye. The trees are still there, producing no dalda, nothing. They're just standing out there. So this is the concerns come from this sort of kind of experiences that have happened and are very possible to kind of reoccur in the islands. And all that many of us are saying is take a step back and think about it again. There are other ways you can invest that money in a much better fashion and to still bring about development in the end and good development. Rather than thinking of red palm oil, why can't they think of coconut oil? The Nicobaris have always been cultivating and some of the best coconuts in the world. Huge coconuts. What you see in Hyderabad and Srikakulam or where here in Goa or in Kerala or in Kashmir, wherever it is, we have tiny, small coconuts like this. Andaman Nicobar has big, beautiful coconuts, thick in their oil and flesh. Superb juice you get from the tender coconut. The sweetest you can have anywhere in India is in Andaman Nicobar. Sweetest. The best coconuts. And those are just being completely sidelined. That's an enterprise which is already existing over there, which can be improved upon and can be expanded upon, and to create local economies of great value. And this is what Manish Chandi says, and not what Government of India says. So I'm not against development. As an environmentalist or as a social science or a social ecology researcher, I also view many of these economic developmental ventures with scorn or with the bias. But despite that, I have lived in those islands for 25 odd years and know how valuable those places are, and even the people, how valuable their systems are. There are people who are very nice people on the islands, both settlers and the indigenous communities, well, who need a lot of developmental input for better livelihood and so on. Not necessarily fancy resorts or transshipment terminal, which is not going to affect. It's only going to benefit somebody in Delhi or in Bombay or wherever else. It's not going to benefit them. And they'll get employment as jhadu pocha or some clerk or some employee in the industry here and there. But there are other forms that they need to be developed. Education, medical facilities, transport facilities in the islands, communication, telecommunications. These are infrastructure that needs to be improved upon majorly in the Andaman Nicobar for in-house development to take place. And beyond that, you already have existing agricultural enterprises which can be improved upon, economic ventures in terms of employment, bringing in other forms of or much more benign and smaller and kind of more sustainable industries which people can use to develop themselves and the islands in terms of infrastructure and education and intellect in that sense. And people are not being taught about their own islands. They're learning about Ganga, Jamuna, and the Kaveri rather than learning about where Kalpong is or where Alexandria River is, and where is Mount Tulier, where is Mount Fawcett, and so on and so forth. And I have many concerns. I can keep kind of complaining about talking about many of those issues. And remarks about the Andaman and Nicobar is this: that, like I said earlier on, they are a very unique social ecological system and a part of India, which is something that we should all understand and learn about, not just from the perspective of a freedom struggle or whatever, because the freedom struggle happened in India. People who were transported as enemies of the British colonial enterprise were transported. Many of them were transported to the Andamans as prisoners. That's the only connection that India has with the Andaman Nicobar Islands. And that connection was eventually kind of used to occupy the islands, and therefore its people, the original inhabitants of the islands, came to be part of India. And we have done a very great job over these past many decades of recognizing their integrity and identity as separate indigenous communities and as islanders and so on and so forth. I think it's a very remarkable. And just imagine, friends and I sometimes talk about it. Imagine if Thailand or Japan had kind of taken over the Andaman Nicobar. They would have converted that entire place into one football field or some Fukushima factory or whatever in no time. India has done it very slowly. Only now we are kind of pushing for Fukushima or some kind of new forms of fast track Atmanirbhar kind of forms of development. We need to take a step back and kind of take a look back and kind of think and see what are we doing and who are we doing it for. So my end remarks are this: that it's a extremely, not just a beautiful place, it is a place with rich, beautiful cultural, ecological history and heritage, which should be treasured and developed for those values, and also for other values that the islands can be used for, and for its own community of people living on the island and nature. It's a haven for nature-based tourism. It is a must visit or a place to see, but also to be conserved. And by conservation, I don't mean preserving by putting a bottle and turning a cap and saying it's closed. No, conservation is very different from preservation. Preservation is you put an article into formalin and close the bottle. Conservation is where you open up the place and understand what is existing there, help it survive, help it to move forward, and kind of ensure that it continues or in the best form as possible. And look at sustainable enterprises for the local islander community in the island. That's the most important.